Hello and welcome to another video. In this one, we're going to be talking about repr and what that means in Python, as well as some quick examples and a little library that you might find useful for creating your own reprs. Anyway, let's jump into it. Okay, so repr, R-E-P-R, in Python is a built-in function, and it's basically a shortcut for a method we're going to show in a second. And the point of repr is it's meant to show the representation of an object. That's where repr comes from. And the representation is meant to be something for the programmer. It's not really meant to be a user-facing output, but it's meant to be like debugging information or something you would see in a test or something like that. And yeah, like usually it's not intended for an end user. And you actually see the reprs all the time. In fact, the thing that I have highlighted here is a repr of repr, which is a silly thing that you can do, but you can see that it returns this here. And so what repr is it's a string. And the way you implement it for your own custom classes, I guess jumping a little bit further ahead, is if you have a class, and let's say this initializes with x or something, self.x equals x. You will define your own repr function, and repr takes no arguments, so it's just from whatever self object you have, and it always returns a string. And I believe if you return something other than string, the repr function itself will raise an error. So you should always return a string from the repr function. And in our case, we want to, well, in the general case, what you want to do when you're implementing a repr is you want to show the programmer how you would build an object of the same type with the same values. So in this case, you might want to do an f string, which is type self.name to get the function or the class name to get this c here. And then a parentheses, and then maybe you want the inner objects itself. And so whatever you passed in as x, you want that to be a parameter here. And so you'll do self.x. Now, another thing that actually conveniently fits right here, but I was planning to talk about later, is when you're dealing with string formatting, there is actually a shortcut for repr. So we would probably want to show the representation of this object, but this can get a little bit, verbose, writing the word repr over and over and over. Fortunately, there is a shortcut for repr in string formatting, which is just bang r. And so whatever self.x is, this will string substitute the representation of self.x so that we don't have to manually do that. And so if we do this and we construct C with, let's say, an integer, you can see that we're now you can see that we are now displaying C1 in the terminal. And even if we passed in something else, it's going to show us the resulting representation, because this is an expression that gets computed down to this value. And if we didn't do any of that, we just had any normal class, you will get this default representation, which usually includes, well, it has the less than symbol, then the module path to the class, which I could have actually included in here. I didn't. Maybe we'll go back and fix that. And it contains the memory address. But honestly, the memory address of an object is not super useful, and this default repr is not necessarily helpful for debugging. And so this is why it's often recommended to implement your own representation. Now, if you're inheriting from many of the common, built-in typing libraries, such as like adders or data classes or name tuple or any of those sorts of things, a lot of those will provide representations for you, so you won't have to write your own. And often you can kind of piggyback on those. Like I personally like to use name tuples because it implements, equality, less than representation and construction for me, and I don't have to worry about it. Data classes, that's essentially the same thing. But yeah, and if you wanted to add the module path here, you would do type self. Let's say we had type b. Type self, you could imagine self being here if I were writing out the string representation here, and you could grab module off of the class there, and so you could join that with the dot here. And you may also use qual name instead of name. This is for getting qualified names. If your class is a nested class or in a closure or whatever, this will have a different value from name. This is actually a newish feature in Python 3.4. Maybe it was 3.0. I don't remember. Some version of Python 3. I know it wasn't in Python 2. And the last thing that I wanted to talk about in while talking about repr is there is a standard library module called reprlib. And this can be helpful for implementing reprs in kind of two situations. One where you have a object that may be recursive. And so there is this special recursive repr decorator, which, oops, that is not what I meant to click on, which allows you to automatically replace a recursive call with, dot, 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 or whatever you want it to be. So you can see in this example here, they've used recursive repr on their repr here. And, they're extending some list and they append the list to itself. And so you can see here that, they allied the recursive value with 3 dots, because otherwise it would just print an infinitely long string, and that's not very useful for debugging. There's also some helpers in here for getting reprs from other classes. So if you need to display them, maybe you're probably not writing a test framework or a debugging framework, but maybe you are. And so you will use something like this to display outputs in your framework. For instance, PyTest uses, whether it's a subclass or just a straight instance of this, but it allows PyTest to limit the output of particular locals. Now, another kind of best practice with representations is you kind of have to be careful with the values that you put in them. This is actually one of the reasons that default objects don't have a representation, because there may be sensitive values as part of your object, and so you don't necessarily want to display all of the attributes that are available. Some examples of things you probably don't want to display are like any personally identifiable information, PII, or secrets or credentials or that sort of stuff. And so you tend to want to be careful when having those types of data inside of your class. And most of the reason for being careful about that is if you were to accidentally log one of these classes or one of these instances, you wouldn't want those sensitive values to show up in your log outputs or in your console outputs or wherever you might end up having strings. But anyway, that's repr. And again, this repr function, this built-in function here, is basically just a shortcut for grabbing this double-ended repr attribute and calling it. And you could call it directly if you wanted to, but you should not. you should use the built-in or use bang R if you're doing string formatting. I think that's all I want to talk about repr. Hopefully this was useful. If there are additional things you want me to explain, leave a comment below or reach out to me on the various platforms. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you in the next one.